Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Civil War, a 4-year struggle between the Union in the North and the Confederate States in the South. So we're going to get right into that. Now, I wanted to go over the beginning of the war first, and we reviewed this last time, but I just wanted to brush up as we're getting into the conflict here. Now, if you remember, Lincoln was elected to the presidency in 1860, and the South was not happy with that result. They felt that an abolitionist had been elected to the presidency, and so this is when a lot of the southern states started to secede from the Union, and they formed the Confederate States of America with Jefferson Davis as their president. And so Jefferson Davis ordered the Confederate forces that were assembled to start seizing federal property, forts, post offices, and other federal buildings that were in the South. And so Lincoln, as president, had to decide if he was going to admit that the states had a right to leave the Union or if he was going to send troops to the South to hold those forts and start a civil war with the South. Um, it was also going to be a risk if he sent troops to the South, if we would lose the other 8 slaveholding states that had not yet joined the Confederacy. And so Lincoln had to make a very difficult decision. And it all came to a head at the Battle of Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was a fort off the coast of South Carolina, and they were running low on food supplies. And so Lincoln decided to send ship food to the fort. And he promised the South Carolina governor that no weapons were on the shipment, that this was just aid to the soldiers in the fort. And so the Confederates took this opportunity to try to take that fort as they had been taking other forts and other federal property. So they demanded that Fort Sumter surrender to the Confederacy. Major Robert Anderson, who was leading the fort at the time, refused to do so, of course, and so the Confederates opened fire. So the Confederates fire the first shot of the Civil War. Anderson eventually surrenders on April 13th, 1861, and that is the start of the Civil War. Now, I wanted to go over a couple of key points about both the North and the South and kind of what their situation was. Now, the North believed that they had to fight to save the Union, and that's their main goal at the beginning of the war. Now, certainly slavery is a major cause of the Civil War. It's definitely what the South is fighting about. But for the North, they're not necessarily interested in abolishing slavery as their official goal. It's definitely, a sub goal of what they're doing. But there are a lot of racists in the North. Racism is, of course, the belief that one race is superior to another. And many Northerners approved of slavery. So ending slavery is not the major goal at the beginning of the war, but it will become so for the North later on. We also have 8 states that were still in the Union in April 1861. And that's going to be Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, and 4 other states that Lincoln was worried about leaving the Union. But those 4 that I just mentioned are border states, and they're going to eventually decide to remain in the Union. So the Union is not just free states during the Civil War, it's also these slave states, these border states that are going to be part of the Union. We also have pro-Confederate mobs attacking Union troops in some of these areas, and one of those is going to be Baltimore, Maryland. And so Lincoln decides to declare martial law, which is rule by the army instead of an elected government. Now, a lot of people view this as a gross abuse of presidential power by Lincoln, but a lot of historians agree that things like this were necessary in order to keep the Union together through the course of the war in order to preserve the Union. So there's going to be a lot of people against this martial law. If you think about what things are like today, if President Trump were to declare martial law somewhere, or one of the governors, or something like that, there would be a lot of pushback to that. And you can imagine how you might feel if a president, any president, were to declare martial law in a certain area. We're going to see this throughout American history, especially in the 20th century. a really famous example is not necessarily martial law, but the use of the military to escort the students in Little Rock, Arkansas, to school during the civil rights movement. So we'll see times where it is necessary for a president to take on more power than we might be comfortable with in times of peace or stability. We're seeing this now with our own coronavirus crisis. Different governors are taking different powers to try to protect the population. Some people are against that. Some people are for it. And so we definitely have times like that even today that we can relate to this. Now, the North had a lot of advantages, getting back to the Civil War here. They had a large source of volunteer soldiers. In the North, they had more free citizens. Their population was about 22 million people. So that's plenty of people to do the fighting, grow food, work in factories. The factories are producing weapons and supplies, and the North has plenty of those. And they also had 70% of the nation's rail lines, which means it's going to be a lot easier to transport soldiers and supplies throughout the war. So that's going to be a major advantage as well. And then the North also has a very strong Navy in the form of the United States Navy and a large fleet of trading ships. We have all kinds of port cities in the North, Boston, New York, and so on, that are going to be able to use their ships for the war effort as well. Some disadvantages for the North. It was very challenging to try to conquer the South. It's a huge area and unfamiliar territory to a lot of the Northerners. So that's going to be a major disadvantage, a major challenge that they're going to have to overcome. And then their supply lines. They've got 70% of the nation's rail lines. Those are going to be really vulnerable to attacks from the South. So those are just two challenges that the North is going to be facing. So if we look at our map here, kind of who is who, who's on which side here. So everyone in the North is going to be the green states here, even these dark green states. So this is going to be the Union. These darker green states, of course, are our border states. These are slaveholding states that are part of the Union. And then we have the orange states here, which are the Confederate states. You can see a lot of our major battles happen down here in the South, and even as far west as Texas is going to be impacted. So this is kind of who we're looking at here for our players in the war. Now, the South believed they had a right to secede. They called the Civil War the War for Southern Independence. And we get our other 8 states, or our other 4 states. We had our border states, and then we have Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, who did not join the Confederacy right away. They eventually joined. So those are going to be part of the South as well. Now, Virginia is interesting. Virginia lost the western portion of their state, which eventually becomes West Virginia. And so they break off to join the Union. So even get some factions within the states themselves. Not a ton of advantages for the South. They did have a defensive position, which is going to be helpful for them. And they believed that their cause was worthy. They are fighting for independence from their perspective. They're fighting for their homelands. They're defending their lands, their homes, and they're defending their way of life. But unfortunately, of course, that way of life is built on slavery. They're defending their right to own slaves. They had a much better knowledge of the southern countryside. So going back to our map before, we see a lot of the battles are happening here in the South. That's going to be an advantage for the South. They know the countryside. There's lots of wooded areas that are good for cover. And so they're going to be at an advantage there. And then they also had very strong, experienced leadership in the South, which is really going to help them out as well. Major disadvantages for the South here, though. Very few factories to produce weapons and supplies. They had very few railroads to move troops and supplies. So they've only got about 30% of the nation's railroads for the Civil War. So that's going to be a major detriment to them. And a lot of their railroads only went from like point A to point B. They weren't large networks of railroads either. So that's going to be a disadvantage for them. They had a very weak central government, and their constitution favored states' rights. So if we go back to like the Articles of Confederacy after the American Revolution, we saw that that didn't work out for the United States. The government was too weak, the states were too strong, and they ran into a lot of issues, which is why we ended up having to alter our government into one based on the Constitution, which we have today. So the Confederacy did not learn from that history. They were, again, very concerned with states' rights as part of their reasons for going to war, and their right to own slaves. And so their government's going to be pretty weak in the South. They also had a really small population compared to the North. The North had 22 million people. The South has about 9 million. So it's not really enough people to do the fighting and support the war effort. And about a third of their population was enslaved African Americans, who, of course, you don't want to give enslaved African Americans guns. They might kill their masters. And so the South is going to be very hesitant to allow their slaves to participate. And then they had very few warships. They are breaking off from the United States, so they don't have that resource of ships in the Navy. All right, and you can see on this graph here, major advantage to the North. They have 71% of the population, 91% of factory production is in the North. The North has 71% of the railroad mileage, and then owned 75% of the farmland. So you can imagine food production, supply production, travel, and then just the available population is going to be a major advantage for the North, whereas the South is just in a really bad spot for everything except cotton production. But you can't fight a war with cotton, so that's not going to be real helpful to the South. A couple of Civil War leaders that we're going to be talking about. On the Union side, we of course have President Abraham Lincoln. He is unfortunately pretty inexperienced when it comes to national politics and the military. But he was very patient and he was a strong leader, which is going to make it possible for him to do what he needs to do in order to preserve the Union. And he was also a really good strategist. So even though he didn't have that military background, he was still pretty good when it came to strategies for the Northern cause. And then a couple of generals I wanted to mention. General George McClellan, who's going to be the leader of the Union forces at the beginning of the war. General Ambrose Burnside, who will be a major player. And then, of course, General Ulysses S. Grant, who becomes commander of the Union forces in 1864, towards the end of the war. But he's going to be a really key factor in ending the war in favor of the Union, and will eventually become president of the United States himself. For the Confederate side, we have President Jefferson Davis. Now, he is very experienced when it comes to the military. He attended West Point Academy. He was an officer during the Mexican-American War, and he was Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce. So he has a really strong military background, which is going to be an advantage for the Confederacy. He was also very highly respected for his honesty and courage, which is going to make people eager to follow him. And then two major generals for the Confederate troops, Robert E. Lee, who is commander of the Confederate Army throughout the war, a very brilliant commander, and General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. He gets that nickname Stonewall Jackson at the first major battle of the Civil War at Bull Run. Now, the major strategy of the Union is an aggressive campaign of invasions. They need to invade the South. They want to cut off supply lines, especially along the Mississippi River. They also want to institute naval blockades. So they're going to try to cut off the South from the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf, along the Gulf Coast, Gulf of Mexico. And they had ironclad ships as well, which are regular ships with iron on the outside to make them stronger. And eventually they're just going to try to starve out the South in resources, in actual food, and try to cut them off from everything. So this is Winfield Scott's plan, the Anaconda Plan, it's sometimes called, beginning here in Washington, D.C., the snake cutting off the South from the Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico here, and then all along here to the supply lines in Missouri. So, kind of choking off the South here is kind of the main strategy of the North, which will ultimately be successful. Now, the Confederate strategy is defensive. They feel they can defend the South until the Northerners get tired of fighting. And their goal is to make the war unpopular in the North so that Lincoln is eventually forced to just stop the war and recognize Southern independence. So it's really a battle of wills who can last the longest. And unfortunately, the South, or for the South, they don't have the resources to hold out for very long. All right, a couple of early battles in the first couple of years of the Civil War here. The first one is the Battle of Bull Run, which was the first major battle in the Civil War. It takes place in July 1861. And it showed that the Union and Confederate soldiers needed a lot of training. And it also demonstrated that the war would not be over very quickly. Most people in the United States and in the Confederacy believe that the war is going to be over very quickly. Bull Run shows them that it's not going to be over very soon. And so this is a victory for the Confederacy, which bolsters a lot of Confederate morale to be the winners of this first major battle with the Union. A couple of Union successes here at the beginning in 1862, the Battle of Shiloh, which was one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, and the Battle of Antietam. 23,000 Union and Confederate soldiers were killed or wounded at this battle, but this victory was kind of in the face of waning Union support in the North. And so this boosted the Northern morale and actually is the catalyst for when we see Lincoln announce the Emancipation Proclamation, which we'll get to in a second. And then some Confederate victories. The Battle of Fredericksburg, again, large casualties, 13,000 Union soldiers killed in this one battle. And it's one of the Union's worst defeats of the war at Fredericksburg. And then the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863, another Confederate victory. And this was a major win for General Lee and General Jackson. But unfortunately, the Confederate sentries ended up killing Thomas Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, and he died a few days later. They accidentally shot him. And so that's going to be a blow to the Confederacy to lose such a good general. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, announced right after the Union victory at Antietam, hoping to bolster support for the end of slavery. To emancipate means to free. And so this proclamation frees the slaves living in the Confederacy. Now, that is an important distinction to make. And a lot of people confuse this. The Emancipation Proclamation does not end slavery. It only frees slaves that are living in the Confederate states. Slavery is upheld in those border states, so Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Maryland. So those states keep their slaves, and the Confederate lands that were captured or controlled by the Union at the time also keep their slaves. So the Emancipation Proclamation does not end slavery, just in those Confederate states. So the Emancipation Proclamation is put into effect January 1st, 1863, and it has a major impact on the war. First, for the Union, it changes the purpose of the war. We said at the beginning that the Union was more concerned with preserving the Union than with actually ending slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation puts ending slavery right up there with saving the Union as a major goal of the Union troops. So they're going to be fighting for both of those causes now. It also damaged European support for the South. The South was exporting a lot of cotton to Europe, and with that relationship, they were hoping for European support during the war. But Europe was not real keen on slavery at this point. A lot of European countries had outlawed the slave trade at the beginning of the 1800s. And so once the Emancipation Proclamation frees the slaves in the Confederacy, and the South refuses to free their slaves, Europe decides, okay, we can get our cotton from India and Egypt, and some of those other colonies that we have control of. And so the Europeans um, are not real keen on supporting the South after that. And then the Emancipation Proclamation also weakens the South's ability to fight the war. Over 3 million slaves were growing food, working in iron and lead mines for the war cause, and served as nurses and cooks. And so for Lincoln to just suddenly free those slaves is going to be a major detriment to a third of their population that is fighting and working for the cause of the South. And so, like I said, a lot of Southerners are not going to just go ahead and free their slaves, but it sort of poisons the well for slavery in the South. So it's going to be a major blow to the South's ability to make war. Now, there were a lot of African Americans who served in the Civil War. At the beginning of the war, they were barred from fighting um, in the Union Army, but in 1862, Congress allowed free and enslaved African Americans to enlist in the Union Army. So a lot of African Americans who are serving in the Union Army are going to be assigned to all Black units commanded by white officers. So you're not going to see any Black officers at this point. And they were mostly given non combat duties, building roads, guarding supplies, doing those types of things, rather than actually doing a lot of the fighting. They were also paid only half of what white soldiers were given. And so these were some points of contention between Blacks and whites in the Army. And Black soldiers ended up protesting against these conditions and unequal treatment. And so eventually, African American soldiers were given the opportunity to actually fight in some of the major battles that we see from 1863 to 1864. And they also earned equal pay in the Army. So by the end of the war, we've had about 200,000 African Americans fight for the Union, and 40,000 died in service to the United States during the Civil War. Now, one of the most famous African American units is the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. And they led a famous attack on Fort Wagner near Charleston, North Carolina, in July of 1863. And even though this wasn't a major victory, African American soldiers won respect for other African Americans who were fighting in the war. And so Black soldiers are seen now as people who can actually fight successfully. Sergeant William Kearney was the first African American to win a Medal of Honor from the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. Um, and then we have African Americans in the South as well. Now, Blacks were kept enslaved after the Emancipation Proclamation, but a lot of slaves attempted to sabotage the South's effort by slowing down their work or just straight up refusing to work. And they hoped to weaken the South's efforts in the war. And then after the Emancipation Proclamation as well, thousands of African Americans escaped to the Union, where they would either join the military to fight on the Union's behalf, or they would just live as free African Americans in the North. Now, the Civil War was a savage time period, and a lot of people, not just soldiers, experienced a lot of hardships during the war. Now, from the perspective of a soldier, you're dealing with a really high death toll. Soldiers could be fighting from age 17 all the way up to age 50. So you're going to have a lot of inexperienced soldiers and a lot of soldiers who are, kind of up there in age. And there is massive deaths as a result of new technology during this time. So you're going to get a lot more death than we've seen in previous American wars. Medical care was very crude. So there were often infections. If you were wounded with a bullet or, you had some sort of other wound, oftentimes you weren't cared for properly. The area wouldn't be cleaned properly. And so it resulted in a lot of amputations. We have a soldier here who's had both of his arms amputated here. And there's lots of pictures of soldiers from the Civil War with legs amputated, arms amputated, just because of infection, not just from getting blown off in a battle or something like that. Disease also spread very quickly among the soldiers, especially malaria and pneumonia. So if you weren't being killed in battle, you were being killed by disease. So there were a lot of challenges for the soldiers. Prisoners of war often died of starvation and disease, and there was a very high rate of desertion. People don't want to be living in these conditions where they're not being properly cared for, where they're facing death all the time. And so soldiers in the North and the South deserted pretty often. And unfortunately, the penalty for desertion was being shot. So if you were caught as a deserting soldier, you were shot dead. If people were harboring deserters, they could be shot and killed as well. So they were trying to keep people from leaving the military, which was difficult to do because the conditions were so bad. Problems in the South. So I mentioned before that they had a really weak central government, and as a result of that, Southerners were refusing to pay taxes in the name of states' rights or trying to do their own thing. And so this really crippled the South's ability to fund the war effort. Some states in the Confederacy, like Georgia, even threatened to secede from the Confederacy. So they'd already seceded from the Union. Now they're talking about leaving the Confederate States as well. And there was a draft law, which is mandatory conscription or military service for men between the ages 17 and 50. And so if you didn't want to be drafted, you might try to avoid the draft somehow, injure yourself or something like that. But if you were an able-bodied man, you had to serve in the Confederate Army. And the only exception was if you were a man with 20 or more slaves, you did not have to serve. But the war was very crippling to the Southern economy. You have the cost of the war itself, the loss of the cotton trade with Europe abandoning the South, severe shortages of food, clothing, and other supplies because the South was not able to produce those goods, and then inflation, which is high prices and dwindling value of money. And so this resulted in economic ruin for the South. Civilians faced a lot of issues as well. Any supplies were going straight to the military, and so there were often food shortages for people, starvation for a lot of Southern civilians, and then just facing the hardships of the war, property being destroyed, family members being killed in the war, Union soldiers treating them badly if they came across them. So a lot of difficulties for the South in particular. In the North, there was also a lot of discontent. Some Northerners opposed the war, and they were called Copperheads after the snake. The North also had the draft law instituted. So any able bodied men between the ages of 20 and 45 were required to serve in the military. Now, you could avoid the draft by paying $300, but this brought up a lot of issues about this being targeting the poorest people in the Union. If you were rich enough to avoid the draft, then you got to survive. But if you were poor, you had to face those hardships that the soldiers were facing. And so a lot of people really started to see this as very unfair for the wealthy to be able to survive while the poor had to go and fight. The draft also targeted immigrants. So oftentimes there would be enlistment officers down by the docks when immigrants would come over from Europe in places like New York, and they would sign immigrants up for the Union, give them a gun and a uniform, and then send them off to the barracks to get ready to train and fight. So that was kind of a problem for the North as well. And a lot of people started rioting in northern cities as a result of the draft law. They did not want to be drafted. They didn't want to be drafted into a war that they didn't agree with or into a cause that they didn't agree with. And so Lincoln ended up having to suspend habeas corpus, which is the right to be charged or have a hearing before being jailed. And so people who were rioting or were dodging the draft could be jailed without ever being charged with anything or without having a hearing or anything like that. And so a lot of people were upset, again, seeing Lincoln as abusing his powers as president. But On the other hand, what is Lincoln supposed to do to maintain order and peace in this time of crisis? So there's a lot of debate about whether or not Lincoln did the right thing here. The North is also facing inflation like the South. I said before, inflation is the rise in prices and a decrease in the value of money. And so prices doubled for goods in the North, which is going to affect the civilian population as well. Farming and manufacturing increased, but profiteers were charging an excessive amount of money for goods that the government was desperate for. And so you get some people who are kind of taking advantage of this crisis, sort of gouging the government for money during this time. Women also participated in the war. They're going to be really important to the war effort on the home front. Women are going to be the ones who are taking men's jobs in industries and farms when the men are drafted off to the war. Women also started aid societies to help raise funds for military supplies and also supply troops with food, bedding, clothing, and medicine. So women were very key in aiding the war effort. Women also served as nurses. In the Union, we have a couple of women, Dorothy Dix, Clara Barton, and Sojourner Truth. Dorothea Dix was really famous for her prison and mental hospital reforms that we talked about during the antebellum period. Clara Barton serves as a nurse, and she eventually is the founder of the American Red Cross after the war. And Sojourner Truth, who was a key figure in the women's rights movement we talked about. She worked in hospitals and camps for freed slaves during the war. In the Confederacy, a really famous nurse was Sally Tompkins. She established a hospital at Richmond, Virginia for soldiers. And the service of nurses during the Civil War helps to make nursing an accepted occupation for women after the war. So nursing is going to be or become a big women's work place for women to hold jobs after the war. A couple of victories in the North that are going to serve as turning points in the outcome of the Civil War. We have the Siege of Vicksburg and the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, one major thing that's going to help the North as we get to the end of the war here is that Lincoln appoints General Grant as commander of the Union troops in 1864. So that's going to play a major factor here as well. But with these two big battles in 1863, these are going to be major Union victories that are going to turn the tide in favor of a Union victory in the war overall. The Siege of Vicksburg takes place from May to July 1863. It is a 6-week siege. If you remember, a siege is a military encirclement of an enemy, and they try to blockade or bombard that position in order to force it to surrender. We talked about that with the Alamo before. Eventually, the Confederates surrender in 1863, July 4th, and the Union wins that battle. And it gives control of the Mississippi River to the Union, which was one of their major strategic goals, to try to control the supply lines along the Mississippi River. And it also gives the Union the opportunity to cut off Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana from the rest of the Confederacy. So that's going to be a major blow to the Confederacy. And then we also have, of course, the famous Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863. This is a 3-day battle in which the Confederate soldiers charge into the Union lines. This is called Pickett's Charge, and it resulted in a tremendous amount of deaths, over 7,000 deaths between the Confederates and the Unions, 3,000 to 4,000 deaths on each side in just a matter of 3 days. So that's a pretty big death toll for one battle. And the Confederates end up retreating, and the Union, of course, wins this battle too. So, like I said, Vicksburg and Gettysburg mark a major turning point in the Civil War, in which the Union is going to continue to have victories and eventually win the war overall. Now, out of the Battle of Gettysburg, we get this really famous speech, the Gettysburg Address, which Abraham Lincoln delivers on November 19th, 1863. He delivers this speech to dedicate a cemetery to the memory of the soldiers that were killed in the Battle of Gettysburg. And this speech is really important in American history because it's a statement of a lot of American ideals that needed to be protected during this time of crisis. And so Lincoln states that all men are created equal, which is going to be really profound as we are talking about ending slavery. He talks about the resilience of American democracy and the resilience of the Union and the need to preserve the Union, which is what a lot of this war is about. And he also talks about freedom and popular sovereignty. And so the Gettysburg Address goes down as one of the most famous pieces of American oratory history. It's often quoted in various times of need throughout our history going forward. And of course, it has the really famous first line, 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth to this continent a new nation. Really famous speech given during the Civil War. Now, eventually, the war does come to an end. And one of the reasons for this is that strategy that we mentioned at the beginning for the North to try to choke out the South. And they're going to do this with a strategy called total war. This is Grant's plan, Ulysses S. Grant. And the plan is to destroy food, equipment, and anything else that might be useful to the enemy. Now, this is very common in wars, but it's going to be particularly devastating to the Southern civilians who are suffering a lot of the same hardships as the Confederate Army, lack of food, lack of resources for their survival. So we get two major instances of this total war plan being played out. Union General Sheridan started destroying farmland, livestock, and grain in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia in 1864. So major destruction for the South. And then Union General Sherman makes his famous march after he captures Atlanta, Georgia, and he marches to the Atlantic Ocean. And so in this march, he's going to burn the city of Atlanta. And then on his way to the ocean, he destroys everything in his path: railroads, livestock, tore up fields, burned people's homes and bridges and factories, anything that could be used or helpful to the Confederacy. And that's in 1864 as well. In the fall of 1864, Lincoln is elected for a second term. He runs against McClellan, who wanted a compromise with the Confederacy for peace. But Lincoln wins, and he continues on with his effort to win the war. So our last major conflicts here are the siege of Petersburg and then the battle at Appomattox Courthouse. So the siege of Petersburg was a 9-month siege. Petersburg is near Richmond, Virginia. So this takes place from June 1864 to April 1865. And so once Grant is able to take Petersburg, Lee eventually retreats to a town called Appomattox Courthouse. The capital city of Richmond falls, and Lee eventually surrenders in April 1865. Now, the terms of the surrender are very important because what Grant wants to do is to make sure that there is not going to be animosity between the North and South going forward. It's going to be a really big task to try and rebuild after the Civil War, and he recognizes that there needs to be peace and friendliness between the North and South. So he requires the Confederate soldiers to turn over their rifles. Officers were allowed to keep their pistols, but soldiers could keep their horses. And so they weren't stripped of everything they had. They were able to keep some things. And then the Confederate soldiers were allowed to return home, never to be bothered again. They weren't, imprisoned or anything like that. They were allowed to just go home and carry on as American citizens. And so Grant has this famous quote: "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." And so he says this in response to the Union troops cheering after the Confederates surrendered. So Grant recognizes that this challenge of welcoming the Southerners back into the fold of the United States is going to be very difficult, but necessary in order for peace to continue and for unity to carry on after the end of the war. A couple of unique characters from the Civil War that I wanted to mention. General Burnside, he had a unique style of facial hair, which you can see here. And that is where we get the term sideburns from his name and his facial hair. William McLean is another person, or sorry, Wilmer McLean is another person. He owned the property where the first major battle of the Civil War took place at Bull Run. And after that battle, he ends up moving his family 120 miles southwest to Appomattox Courthouse, which is where the Confederacy surrenders, and the terms of surrender are negotiated at McLean's new home in Appomattox Courthouse. And unfortunately, the Union soldiers destroyed his home because they took little pieces of his property with them, strips of furniture, pieces of wood, anything that they could take as a little memento of the end of the war. So that was kind of bad for old Wilmer McLean. And then we have General Daniel Butterfield as well. He was a general in the Union who was credited with the creation of the song Taps. Taps was originally used as just a bugle call at the end of the day to signal the end of the day for the soldiers. And so it was eventually used in military funerals, and we still use them in military funerals and important events, flag ceremonies, and things like that. Now, the legacy of the Civil War is devastating on the one hand and really great on the other hand. Um, for the negative side, the death toll is astronomical. Over 600,000 Americans killed in the Civil War in a matter of 4 years. 360,000 Union soldiers were killed, and about 250,000 Confederate soldiers were killed. The cost of the war was also very detrimental, $20 billion, which is actually 11 times more than the US spent between 1789 and 1861, which is the beginning of the war. So that entire time for the United States, they didn't spend nearly as much money as was spent in just those 4 years of the Civil War. And the Civil War also represents a turning point in American history. The Republicans gain a commanding position in politics, so they become a major political party with Democrats on the other side. People started referring to the United States as the United States instead of these United States, which is a symbol of the unity that we get after the Civil War. So no longer would you have people like General Lee, who would just fight for their state, where they have more loyalty to their state. Now it is the United States as one country. There were no more threats of secession. We haven't had any more, at least no real threats to seceding from the Union. It increased the power of the federal government. The federal government took a lot of power during this time, especially the presidency, in order to preserve the Union and preserve the war effort. And so we're going to see a continuation of that trend through the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, where the government will gain more and more power, especially as different crises come up. And something really good out of the Civil War is the end of slavery. Now, remember, I mentioned the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery in the country. It's the 13th Amendment that does that. So the 13th Amendment is passed right at the end of the war. And the 13th Amendment officially ends slavery in the United States. And then, of course, a lot of Americans are going to question the meaning of freedom and equality, just as we always have done since the Declaration of Independence. Who's free? What does that mean? All men are created equal. Do women have equal rights? Do Black men and women have equal rights? What are we going to do with all of these free African Americans now in the United States, and what types of rights will they have? We're going to see a lot of challenges to that freedom and equality in the coming years of Reconstruction and going forward into the 20th century. But this is a major turning point in the United States in our history. All right, and that's it.